Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Lisa heard a knock at the door just as she had gone to bed, and it was the police coming to let her know that her teenage daughter had died in a head-on collision. Lisa tells us how she picked up the pieces of her shattered life and how she found ways to thrive and not just survive. From getting support from other moms in her community, she now offers support to grieving moms. Lisa says,
Again, I think I learned a lot from other grieving moms, who were further down the path. And sometimes it was just little snippets that they would say or different things, but they gave me hope. And I think learning that everybody copes with grief differently, that little nugget right there was enough to carry us through.
About this week's guest, Lisa K. Boehm's life changed forever when her daughter died suddenly in a car accident. She quickly discovered that our society struggles with death, loss, and grieving, and has made it her mission to change that. In her book, Journey to Healing, A Mother's Guide to Navigating Child Loss, she shares her experience with grief and how she intensified her love for her daughter. Now she focuses on gratitude and living intentionally as a way to honor her daughter's memory. Lisa is an author, speaker, and certified grief educator who helps bereaved moms to move beyond the pain to find peace and purpose. I hope you enjoy today's episode. So welcome, Lisa. It's so nice to have you here. Thank you for taking the time for this podcast. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your life, and as we just spoke about before starting this, stories have a power, and we'd love to hear your story of loss and trauma.
Well, prior to December of 2015, the biggest concern in my life was when the next holiday would be and how we would coordinate the four busy people in our life. My husband, myself, both work in healthcare. We had two very, very active teenage children, and that was our biggest worry in life. How do we coordinate all these four moving people? And then the unspeakable happened. I think it's every parent's worst fear to get that knock on the door. And we got that knock on the door. My daughter had left the house on a regular Tuesday night to run an errand. And my kids always had to be home at 10 o'clock on a school night. So I texted her at 9:45 and said, see you soon. Hope you're on your way. And climbed into bed. And 15 minutes later, instead of my daughter Katie walking through the door, we had a police officer and the coroner standing in our entry. And Katie had been involved in a head-on collision and died at the scene. And life, as we knew it, had changed forever. Even learning how to become a family of three, not a family of four, how to eat supper at the dinner table when there's always an empty chair, watching other people's children graduate high school when yours won't. Katie was 17 years old. Oddly enough, the child I never worried about. She was always focused on her education. She had just earned herself an entrance scholarship into the Faculty of Nursing with a 95% average. And she was always super focused on fitness and health. She'd been a competitive dancer most of her life. For fun, she would take my bike and bike about 20 kilometers to the local hill and run up and down that hill until she couldn't do it anymore. And then she'd bike home. And she'd do that for fun. She was always really conscious about what she put into her body and so on. So I thought, what's there to worry about? She seemed to have a really good grasp on things. She was feisty and sassy and, like a regular 17-year-old that way. She loved clothes. She loved makeup. And I just didn't really worry about her. She had the best boyfriend, a mom could ever ask for her daughter. But this was really something that you just can't see coming.
Yeah.
You can't see coming. You just don't imagine the day that you give birth that you will have to say goodbye this way or not get to say goodbye this way. So it's really been a journey. My son was 15 years old at the time, going through his own normal teenage struggles at that time. And it really put everything in our lives to the test. My marriage, my relationship with my son. Yeah, it's been a journey.
How did you deal with that early on when
You
all this came
know,
together?
I will never forget sitting on the couch across from the police officer. I remember it like it's yesterday. My husband was on my left. My son was on my right. I remember my response, my physical response was not actually crying. It was shaking uncontrollably.
Mm-hmm.
I was literally bouncing on the couch.
Yeah, that's a typical trauma response.
But I remember the officer speaking to me, and once he kind of said that Katie had died, it's almost like my mind went into overdrive. Like, I've got to hold this little family together. Come hell or high water, I will hold this family together. Like I said, my son rather was, going through normal teenage stuff, but I was afraid of losing him too. You realize how fragile life is. You never think these things are going to happen to yourself. You read about them in the news, you hear about them in your community, but it'll never happen to you. So you think, well, if I can lose one child, that means I could lose another. And I really was just in this hyper alert stage, if you will, of being horrified of every time anybody left the house. To this day, sirens will put me into a frenzy. I am much, much better at dealing with them now. I've had a lot of work. I've done some PTSD work on that, but I lived in fear for a long time. I don't know that I fully let myself grieve in the beginning because I felt so strongly about getting the three of us through grief. And I use that with air quotes because we don't, as you know, there's no end point with grief, no end point. But that was the approach that I took initially. I bottomed out, I would say, probably about that 6-month mark.
Bottomed out meaning?
Well, I don't share this with too many people, but the fact of the matter is that I really contemplated for a long time. I tried to figure out how many sleeping pills and how many bottles of wine together would equal getting to the other side to see Katie. It was a pretty dark time. I say this, I'm sure it was more complicated than this, but I say this, but honestly, I looked at Katie's picture, and even though in the picture she was smiling, her beautiful smile, I could almost see disappointment in her eyes. And then I looked at my son's picture and I thought, what hope does that boy ever have of getting his feet underneath him if I were to pull the carpet out again and take my own life? If I truly want to be there for my husband and my son, this is not the way to do it. So that's when I really realized that I needed help, and I sought professional help. But that's also the point when I recognized that I needed to do a lot of work on myself.
How much after her death was that approximately? So
that was about 6 months when I was really, really, really in a very dark spot.
Yeah.
And I recognized that I hadn't maybe been grieving, that I had been focused so much on being strong that I needed some help.
Yeah.
So I sought professional help, but I also sought other resources as well. I sought local women who had lost children. And I really resonated with the moms who wanted to find the way forward. I don't know that group particularly used the word healing. I know that word can really rub people the wrong way because there's no endpoint. It's not like a cut that scabs over and eventually heals. It's always there. But I found women who were a little bit further down the road than me and that, spoke their truth, but they were in a better spot than me. And I found that gave me hope. And I found that surrounding myself with those kinds of women really helped me. I also found journaling extremely helpful. Grief can bring out some pretty raw feelings. And some of those feelings were anger. frankly.
Mm.
And I needed to express that anger without lashing out at other people. So I found that my journal was safe. I could yell and scream inside my journal with my pen, and I wasn't hurting anyone, but I was relieving that buildup inside of myself. I also found that my journal never judged me. I could say all kinds of things. I look back now at some of the things I wrote, and they were downright frightening, but it was a safe place for me to just say what was on my mind.
I think that's a really good resource that you mentioned here. I remember after the suicide of my mother, which is 4 months after my daughter died, I had months of anger, and I wrote anger letters to her. And because also she was in continuous dreams, and it was just too much to bear with. So that was also between 6 and 12 months after my daughter died. So I think many people listening to this will relate to the anger. And I say to people always, well, there's two ways. There's anger interjected and projected. So there's either lashing out at people, or it is self-directed as maybe guilt, shame, or telling ourselves what we did wrong, or trying to find things we did wrong. How was it for you? Was it more interjected, or was it more projecting at others?
I think it's a bit of both for me. I think there was that period right after Katie's accident when both my husband and I were kind of stuck in those what if questions. What if I hadn't let Katie go out last night, or, that night? She was just running out for an errand. I could have said, no, you don't need to go out tonight. My husband said he had been planning to take her car to the car wash and fill it up with gas. What if he had actually done that? And we just almost really got stuck in that spot for a long, long time. So I think a lot of the anger was at ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel this way, but there was a very short period of time where my husband was actually angry at my daughter for dying, which never really made sense to me. I mean, the accident was her fault. We really don't know what led to the accident, but it was ultimately her fault. And I can't speak for him, but his anger was at her for a bit.
Yeah.
And then I would say my anger turned actually to my immediate circle. Truthfully, and I feel a little bit terrible saying this, but truthfully, I was really angry at my family. It took me a long time to realize they couldn't be the people to support me. Not that they didn't love me, not that they didn't care, but that they were grieving too.
Yeah.
My parents only have 2 grandchildren, my daughter who's in heaven and my son. They were grieving their granddaughter. They were grieving for me, their own daughter. They couldn't fix the problem. And my brother just in a different place altogether, not equipped to support me. And it took me a long, long time that even the people that love you the most, or that you love the most, or you expect to be there, just because they're not there doesn't mean that they don't want to be supportive.
It's also often the closest people to us that we feel most comfortable to sharing all the different emotions that contain grief.
You're right.
And then what happened? How did you and your husband and your family deal with the fact that it was difficult to support one another?
Again, I think I learned a lot from other grieving moms, who were further down the path. And sometimes it was just little snippets that they would say or different things, but they gave me hope. And I think learning that everybody copes with grief differently, that little nugget right there was enough to carry us through. Because I think in our heads, you think, well, gosh, I married this person. We more or less agree on parenting. We more or less agree on finances. We more or less agree on pretty much everything. How could we possibly grieve so differently? So instead of me questioning this all the time, I just accepted it. My husband and I would often just say the words, I love you, and I'm sorry I can't be a better support for you right now. And that was just enough, enough for us to know that the other person was there as much as they could be. I was very much a doer in my grief. I guess I should back up and say, I've been with the same employer for 31 years and have been fortunate enough not to have been sick a whole lot over those years. So I had buckets and buckets of sick time to take. So after Katie died, I took 10 months off.
Wow.
Sick time.
Yeah, great.
And pretty much 100% of the time worked on my grief. I mean, there was that bit in the beginning, obviously, that was very, very dark. But after that, I really spent a lot of time on self-care. I quickly realized that getting outside every single day for some fresh air was a good thing. Connecting, having coffee with other grieving moms, going for therapy, just doing things that help me. Right away that first year, we created a scholarship, and I was always doing things, and I needed to talk. I needed to be active in my grief is, I guess, the best way I can say it. And my husband, he's a very cerebral man. His formal training is in pharmacy. He went back to work just a few weeks after we lost Katie, but he went back for just short days. He would drop our son off at high school. He would go to work for a few hours. He would pick our son up. That was his day. And the poor guy, he would walk in the house and I would say, I have a great idea. We're going to have a memorial garden, at the school or whatever it was that was on my mind. And I would start talking. And there were some days that I literally got the hand, like he would say, I don't want to talk. And he would disappear into the basement. And then I would sometimes say, well, I'm going out. I'm going to go for a walk with so-and-so, or I'm going to go for coffee with the ladies. I needed to do my grief that way. He needed to do his grief in a quiet way. And our son, of course, found a third different way to do it. And that was really hard too, because on one hand, I wanted to kind of bubble wrap him and duct tape him to the basement wall and never let him out of my sight. But you realize that you can't do that. So it was really a learning curve. I mean, there was definitely a period, probably in that first year, if somebody would have asked me, I'm not sure that my marriage would have lasted if they would have asked me just at that point. Mm-hmm. Plus, you're bombarded with information. Your marriage isn't going to last. Your surviving children are looking at a lifelong struggle with mental health and maybe addictions, and it's kind of bleak, right? But we found our way. I mean, I think, marriage-wise, I think my husband and I are as strong as we've ever been. We've grown back together. And we have an excellent relationship with our son, but we're also 6.5 years out. It's taken that time to get to this place.
What did he do? How did he deal with
my husband?
Loss? No, your son.
My son.
You mentioned that he found a third way, but I'm curious to find out what he did. Because I'm guessing that lots of people listening to this say, okay, well, is my teenage son or daughter doing this correctly? Are they actually grieving or not? So how did your son deal with it?
Well, I believe in transparency, and I believe that, if my son went through this, probably somebody else's son is going through this. But my son had 2 tools in his tool belt, and they were anger and pot. And it seemed like if he wasn't lashing out with anger, he was using pot. And here in Canada, pot is now legalized. At that point, it wasn't. And he was 15 years old. To say that I was concerned is a gross misunderstatement. I was very scared for him. He did not want to talk about it. It seemed like the more I tried to hang on to him, the more he tried to pull away, the more rules, the more, guidelines that we tried to give him, the more he broke them.
Yeah.
It was awful. It was hell for probably the first 2 years. I've told him many times, I have cried at least as many tears for you out of fear as I have for losing your sister.
Yeah.
As crazy as it sounds, I think Katie helped him through. Gave, from the other side, gave him some guidance. I think we got lucky in a lot of ways. I think things presented themselves at the right time for him. He discovered other things that filled his heart, like mechanics, fixing cars. There was a real transition there when he hit 17. And I don't know if that was just a moment when he realized that he was now older than his sister ever would be. I don't know what it was, or if it was just a maturity thing, but he seemed to pull it all together. And now he's just in a fantastic place. I don't even think I can take any of the credit for it. I think he just really came to a realization that, he started seeing a future for himself. What do I want? What are my goals? How do I get there? Well, is this going to help me? Is this going to hinder me? And he's very healthy and very happy and very successful now. But it was a long, ugly road.
And you said, I don't think I can take any credit for that. So what helped him, or how did he help himself come out of this phase? Because I'm guessing that other mothers in your situation would say, well, I want to help my child. What did you do, or what didn't you do in regards to your son?
I think out of fear and out of anger, we were really hard on him in the beginning. You skipped class, and, you were doing this, and, it was just negative, picking on him kind of thing.
Mm.
And we realized that wasn't working. So It was really, we just tried to turn the tables of conversation. He started taking an auto mechanics class at school, and he would absolutely light up when he talked about this. It's not an area I'm particularly interested in, and I certainly don't know anything about it. But, the 10 minutes that we were actually sitting at the dinner table, we would make it all about him and all about the good things in his life. We would find the good things. Tell me about what you did in auto mechanics today. Oh, that sounds really great. Can you explain that to me? Or even when he was hanging out with people that we really didn't want him to, he's always been a very kind person. He would, get up in the middle of the night and go pick up a buddy who was in trouble and, help them out. And I would say, I really admire that about you. I'm so proud of you for being that kind of friend. And we actually started just focusing on the good things in his life.
Yeah.
And I think as human beings, we all like a pat on the back.
Yeah, sure.
We all like to talk about the things that bring us joy and happiness. And it was like things just started to change a little bit. When we thanked him for, doing things, he would do them more.
Exactly.
And it was just a very slow and gradual progression. He discovered, like I say, what brought him joy. And for him, it was working on cars and taking things apart, putting them back together. And we supported that. We actually loaned him our garage for the summer. And I think that was the biggest turning point for him, was he just really found something else, another tool to put in his tool belt to help him cope.
And that's a form of grief therapy, right? Taking it apart and looking at each part and then putting it back together.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. I mean, for me, and this is part of my first book, Grieving Parents, it was really about the understanding of the difference in grieving between men and women, but between people in general, not necessarily gender specific, which is, I remember very clearly at the very beginning, we went to a grief support group at the hospital where we gave birth. And there was this woman who explained the difference between instrumental and instrumental and emotional grievers. And it was like an epiphany. I must have heard that before, but I was in grief brain. But it makes sense. And it made so much sense as to understanding that even though we lost the same person, the same relation, our child, it doesn't mean that we're doing that in the same way.
I was just going to say, I think, if we even take the loss of a loved one out of the equation, we're just different people.
Full stop.
All of us.
Yeah.
We cope, prior to losing a child or whatever trauma it is that we faced, if you look back in the years, I coped with things in a certain way. You may have coped with things in a different way. So we've got not only our previous experience at life, but we've got other experiences, unique experiences, our childhood, our upbringing. There's so much, I think, that goes into how we cope or manage or grieve, whatever you want to call it. It's not just, oh, I have grief. Now there's, choice A, B, and C of how to do this. It's just, I think everybody on the planet probably grieves slightly different.
Exactly. What would you wish you would have known at the beginning of your grieving and healing journey?
There's a lot of things. I guess first and foremost, knowing what I know now, I would have liked for someone to be able to take me by the hand and say, you're going to survive this. One grieving parent to another, because for somebody to say that who hasn't lost a significant person, I think those words can maybe be a little bit empty.
Yeah.
But for another grieving mother to say, okay, I'm going to walk this road with you. You're going to survive. I know it's going to seem impossible. You're going to survive. That would have been one thing I would have liked to know. And the other thing, it took me a long time to be able to speak my truth on this, but there can be joy again. I have found joy. It's not every day. My life is not rainbows and unicorns and lollipops, but there are moments of joy. And I think, sadly, between society and some of the literature that's available, there's nothing but bleak, dark futures. Basically, your life is over. And while it feels that way, especially in the beginning, it doesn't have to be that way forever. And I guess that's part of the reason why I wrote my book, because I just found I would take books out of the library, I would buy books. I had a mountain of books, and I found so few of them offered me hope and offered me constructive things I could do. It was just doom and gloom. Like I say, your marriage is over, you're surviving children, myriad of problems, and life is over. And I wanted to give a message to other moms that, we can get through this together, and there is some hope.
I smile as you say that, because we have that in common. And I realize that there is part of the grieving community that believes grief is a life sentence. And I do not believe it, and it's not my experience. And I see that light in you too. And I think it's important for people to know. And you said that so beautifully. You said, as much as it feels like that at the beginning, this is not our experience. And if it is, and we're not the only two here, I know, and I've interviewed many other people who say it exactly that way. If some people have experienced it, not just talk about it nicely, then there must be a way. Yeah. So you said, I found moments of joy. Now, if someone were to know, well, how did you do that? How does one do that? How do we find moments of joy again?
I think that's a two-part answer I'll give. One is, I think we have to be open to that happening. And I'll just tell a quick story about how I made that realization myself. After we lost Katie, as I said, I took off 10 months. And part of that was, spending time together as a family of three. We traveled a fair bit. But I remember walking down a beach, and it was just a perfect day. Sun was shining. It was the perfect temperature. It felt like a warm blanket. Sky was gorgeous. The trees were gorgeous. The beach was everything. It was just picture perfect. And I remember leaning my face up towards the sun and felt joy for the first time in months. And then it was almost like I could hear the car tires screech, and I was giving myself heck. I said, Lisa, you can't feel joy. What is wrong with you? Your child is dead. But then I took a step back and I thought, but that moment of feeling joy, it didn't make my grief less. It didn't make me miss Katie or love her less. So it was kind of a moment, it was a really huge aha moment for me, because I realized that I could carry grief in one hand and joy, happiness, gratitude, call it whatever you want, in the other hand. And it didn't take my grief away. So it was kind of encouraging for me that I could continue to live and find these moments and not feel guilty. So I think on one hand, we have to realize that, and then we have to just be open to it and find it, look for it. And it doesn't have to be big moments like walking on the beach. It can be appreciating the sunset or smiling at the dogs playing in the backyard.
Yeah. And I have a beautiful person who's teaching me or who's reminding me to see those beautiful little things. My daughter is 11 years old and she's growing. She was growing up as I grew up my grief. So I have this metaphor of the grief child that is also growing up with me, my grief being a child. And the older she gets, the less she needs me. And the more freedom I have in between. And then sometimes she needs me and she requires my attention. Mommy, I need you. And sometimes not. So that's not an undermade. That's my grief child. And she can be so happy about a little caterpillar or like a little snail. And so taking that on what you're saying, taking that on our journey. And one thing that you said about joy being the simultaneous experience of grief and joy. I think that's one of the gold nuggets for people to understand, because often at the beginning it's either or. And also the guilt tripping as to, I can't feel joy or any of the other things that are as if they are in, what's the word? In competition with the grief. As if I feel good, it is not grief. Or if I feel happy, it takes something away. But that can coincide.
That's something that I have learned as well, that our feelings, I think we can only experience one feeling or one emotion at a time. And yet the fact is, we can feel a myriad of emotions at the same time. When we think we have, I don't know what the number is, 64,000 thoughts a day, there's a little emotion that's attached to all of those thoughts. Like, I got to make a grocery list, that's attached to something. So we actually do have coexisting emotions all the time. We're just not aware of it. We think that everything has to be a silo, and it's not.
And I think that's why people at the beginning of grief, they feel so overwhelmed, because the immensity of the emotions which entail grief, without going into naming them, but one of them being sadness or despair, but they are so overwhelming, but they're also part of one family. And along the grieving journey, others come in as well, again. And so it's not to put them into competition or comparison. They're just part of the human experience. Now, also what you said before about you wished you had someone to come and take you by the hand and walk that journey with you. I don't know if you know, but in German, there's actually a word loosely translated would be grief accompaniment. And so the profession to do exactly what you're saying is a companion in grief. Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful expression of that, which is having someone there to walk with you and not to fix or fade any of the experience, but to just be present with that person.
That's so, so true. And I think that's why we appreciate meeting people who are going through the same kind of thing as we are, because we're not there to fix each other. We're just there to lean in, to listen, to share, and just be together, really. And I think that's something that it would be nice, for one day to maybe help society realize that, to be there for somebody in grief doesn't mean that you're there to fix them or offer solutions or, any of that, but just to be there.
I think the two most important things that I find is the validation of their people's experiences, because they go through something that is so usually not experienced ever before. And they also don't see many other people go through that together experiences. Like motherhood, for example, you have an experience of your own mother, but then you also see other experiences of motherhood. But then grief is something in an intense situation of a extreme, sudden, unexpected or traumatic loss. We don't get a lot of experiences of that size before. So then it's like, well, I don't know how to do this. I've never done this, and I haven't got a lot of role models on how to do that. And I think the validation of you, Lisa, and I also want to let people know we put all the links in the show notes, because Lisa is actually such a person who walks with people in grief and supports them and shows them the way, because it's normal not to know the way.
You're absolutely right. I for myself, I felt like I had this huge mountain, like a sheet of rock in front of me. And you just think, you look up and you think, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I can't. But it's amazing what we can do when we have a little bit of hope and when we've got the right people by our side, because then we find the strength, we find the courage to take those little steps. And it's amazing when you take a tiny step forward every day, every week, every month, whatever it is. In time, you look back. I look back on my over 6.5 years, and I never in a million years thought I would still be on my own 2 feet, living a life. My family would be different, but doing well, all things considered.
Based on your work with people going through grief and your experience, what would you want them to know that makes a difference if they are very early on in their grief?
Very early on, probably 2 things. I would really suggest that they find a good counselor, because I do think, somebody who's got the training behind they do bring something else to the table that somebody like myself, somebody that works peer to peer, something different. But I do think finding a group of people going through the same thing that you are, with, I guess, the mindset that you really resonate with, is powerful. Not everybody resonates with the idea of finding joy, and you may not be at that point right now, but do find somebody in your community that you can see face to face. Hopefully COVID laws have lifted wherever people are to allow that. But I found that very, very helpful. When you do meet those people that are a few years out, and even asking them, like, what has helped you? That's how I started with grief yoga. That's how I started with journaling. That's how I started with all kinds of things, was the idea from another grieving mom. And just that person or that group to connect with when you're having a really awful day or an awful week, because they get it. They get it. And they're really the best support I have found on my own journey.
Where did you find your group?
I was lucky enough that one of the women where I work, just one floor up, had also lost her son in a car accident a few years prior to my daughter dying, and she reached out right away. I do know that Compassionate Friends is a worldwide support group for parents, and I think they have loads and loads of chapters throughout the world. I would Google that, see what's close to you. That would be a good start. You could also start with the hospitals, the palliative care units, and just start asking your family doctor. The more people you ask, the more you're going to find. This isn't, unfortunately, something that we talk about all the time. So prior to losing someone, you just don't know about the resources.
Yeah, exactly, because it's not something that we prepare for.
No.
We're gonna put those links as well in the show notes. We've talked about that in other episodes as well. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. And I know I want people to know as well that you offer support, and please go and check out Lisa's website that we're gonna link in the show notes. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your authenticity in sharing both the hardship as well as the rays of hope that you found along your journey. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And as I always end this podcast, I'm going to ask a couple of sentence starter or rapid fire questions. Shall we do that?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay. So grieving and trauma means?
I don't really know how to answer that.
And healing means?
To me, healing is a bridge. It's a bridge from our grief, our brokenness, bridging it to the hope. We never get to a point where we are healed, but we can walk over that bridge.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
I have learned that the only thing that I can control is how I react. And I choose to react from a place of gratitude for having Katie for 17 and a half years. I know not everyone is that lucky. I choose to react from a place of love and compassion and understanding.
And one thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma?
You carry it with you every single day.
One specific thing that has changed since my loss and trauma that I wouldn't want to miss?
Honestly, that moment on the beach, that big aha moment for me when I discovered for myself that grief and joy can and do coexist.
Beautiful place to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Lisa, for all that you shared with us. It's been a pleasure to hear from your journey with loss and healing. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.